and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League empowers voters and defends democracy. The League of Women Voters is fully committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in principle and in practice. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are central to the organization's current and future success in engaging all individuals, households, communities, and policymakers in creating a more perfect democracy. Anyone over the age of 16 is welcome to join the League of Women Voters, and membership for students is free. Tonight, we're hosting a public forum on dark money in Michigan politics. Our speaker is Simon D. Schuster, who will recap the 2020 election, which shattered records as the most expensive in Michigan's history. Simon will provide an overview of money's growing role in our political system and how everyday people can hold their elected officials accountable. If you have questions during the presentation, you can write them in the chat questions area, and we will read them to Simon later in the program. We also have some questions that were submitted in advance of the event. Simon D. Schuster is the Executive Director of the Michigan Campaign Finance Network, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that seeks to shine the brightest light possible on the role of money in Michigan politics. He became Executive Director of the Michigan Campaign Finance Network in November of 2019. Before joining the Campaign Finance Network, he worked as a journalist for Michigan Information and Research Service, MIRS News, an online news service, and freelanced for the Washington Post and the Detroit News. He earned a BA and Masters of Public Policy from Michigan State University. And now I will turn it over to Simon.
Debbie, thank you so much. I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters, the Northern Lower Peninsula and Eastern Upper Peninsula chapters for having me this evening. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you this presentation on sort of money in our 2020 election and sort of its consequences in Michigan. Let me share my screen here so that you all can see this presentation. Now, just to give everyone a little bit of background about the Michigan Campaign Finance Network and what we do, let me make sure that these bars are out of the way here. We are a 25-year-old organization, just about 25 years old. We're also explicitly nonpartisan. We have former and current public servants who serve on our board, both Democrats and Republicans from across the ideological spectrum, and we mainly work in two programs. The first is reporting, where we do investigative journalism and research on campaign finance and issues relating to money and politics in Michigan. And then we also do outreach, in other words, presentations to groups like this one about campaign finance issues and their impact on our political system. So what is this program going to be about tonight? I'm going to briefly discuss sort of the money in the 2020 elections, along with how our campaign finance system works, both in Michigan and at the national level, and what we can do about some of the problems, what we might view what the problems with our campaign finance system are, and how we can go about looking at solving them. So let me just get out of the way sort of the big number for this program, which is the overall cost of Michigan's 2020 election. And this is a record-shattering amount of money, at least $510 million, which is far and away the most expensive election Michigan has ever had, and breaks the previous record, which was broken in just 2018, which was about $328 million by a considerable amount. And I say at least because of the proliferation of dark money, it becomes very difficult to get at an exact figure, in part because we don't know, for example, the full extent of the spending in areas like political mail or online advertising from dark money organizations. Similarly, even some of the organizations that voluntarily report political spending, like Google, for example, they make a report of their political advertising available online, but it's a range. And so when you look at all of the total sum of money spent by all of the political ads aired in Michigan in the 2020 election, they'll tell you it's between $5 and $150 million. So that's why we say at least 510 million. Now, that said, we could still say with confidence that this broke records in a variety of areas. In 2020, Michigan had the most expensive U.S. House elections in its history, the most expensive state house elections in the state legislature in Michigan's history, and far and away the most expensive U.S. Senate election in the state's history, along with the highest amount of money spent on a presidential race in the state's history. And I can provide you with some details as to where this money was coming from. In the U.S. Senate race, for example, we had a total of $206 million spent. And while each candidate raised about $50 million themselves, there was 100 plus outside groups that advertised in the race. This was an election that was rife with dark money, and the large majority of the PACs in this race were super PACs, which, while they report and disclose their donations, were often from dark money entities. And so we just simply don't know where the original source of those funds are. In the presidential race, we saw about 150 million in broadcast advertising alone. And these are provisional numbers. I haven't yet had the time to do thorough analysis of this. So even the $510 million amount itself is a provisional amount. Now, $21 million of that amount was in political mail. Those were sent largely by the state parties, not by the campaigns themselves, but were disseminated through some complex maneuvering that we can discuss a little bit later on. Now, there was at least, or up to $50 million in Facebook ad spending from an enormous number of organizations. And so you can see in the images here a couple examples of some of the advertising in this race. One of them, the forward image, is a ad delivered in Spanish to during the primary season, saying that there's if socialist Bernie Sanders is elected, there'll be 4 more years of Donald Trump. And this was released during the primary season by a group that was favoring Joe Biden. And then behind that is a ad released, and this ad actually didn't comply with campaign finance laws because it didn't have the required disclosures, but was released by the Michigan Chinese Conservatives Association that was essentially talking a great deal about Trump's tough stance on China and how that would be good for Chinese Michiganders. And so the volume of communication and outreach in this election was just so high that I'm still sort of working through these data to get a precise estimate of this cost. I'm sure all of you at home were probably found this inescapable, either from television advertisements or in your mailbox. Now, the U.S. House race was also a record-breaking election with about $86.5 million spent. This is more than double the amount of 2016, where only about $40 million was spent, but only about $6.5 million over 2018's $80 million total. On average, the total cost of the races in each district increased by about $400,000 across the board. But and the most expensive one was in the I'm sorry, not the 6th district. That's a typo, but the 3rd district at about $16.1 million. That said, the most expensive single congressional race of all time is still in 2018, which was the 8th district race between Alyssa Slotkin and Mark Bishop in the 8th district. And really, the 3rd district between Peter Meyer and Hillary Scholten was a late-breaking race that not a lot of people knew a lot about and had an enormous amount of money poured into it, as it became considered somewhat of a toss-up relatively late in the campaign season. And as a result, while lots of money was poured in, there wasn't a lot of knowledge about the candidates. And so this video here shows an example of what happens when there's lots of money to spend, but not a lot to talk about. These advertisers used talking points that were to attack Peter Meyer that were arranged by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Although one of them is Skolton's campaign, and one of them is D-Trip, the other two are independent spenders. But what this results in is a electoral environment for the voters and people of that district where things start to sound like an echo chamber, and they keep hearing the same things over and over again. This is the 4 ads spliced together, and the numbers indicate which advertiser is being played, and you'll hear just how repetitive it is.
There's no good time to lose your health insurance. This year has got to be one of the worst. Peter Meyer, with a $50 million trust fund, will never understand that.
A lot of Michigan families are struggling. But Peter Meyer has a $50 million trust fund and doesn't care about us.
It's easy living for Peter Meyer. But for everyday Michiganders, life can be hard and getting harder.
A trust fund. That's what Peter Meyer was given.
Meyer promised he'll repeal the law that protects people with pre-existing conditions.
Peter Meyer promised to fully repeal our health care protections, letting insurance companies deny coverage to people with pre-existing conditions.
Peter Meyer promises to repeal our health care system, leaving those with pre-existing conditions without coverage.
But Meyer wants to take more. Take health care from hundreds of thousands of hardworking people in Michigan. Take protections away from those with pre-existing conditions.
Millions would lose health coverage and older folks would get charged more.
And charge older Americans 5 times more. An age tax. That's a lot of money for those of us who don't have $50 million trust funds.
Forcing seniors to pay more. A pledge to protect tax handouts for corporations and the very wealthy? Easy for millionaire Peter Meyer. How would we have to pay for it? Cut Social Security and Medicare.
During the pandemic, Meyer put insurance profits ahead of people. This is no time to send Peter Meyer to Congress.
I'm Hillary Skolton, and I approve this message.
Peter Meyer just doesn't get it. DCCC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
That's an easy no on Peter Meyer. Women Vote is responsible for the content of this ad.
Peter Meyer has taken enough. Don't give him your vote.
So you can see here how, despite legally being unable to coordinate some of these groups, they're still able to use almost identical messages. And I'll talk a little bit later on about just how easily outside groups and outside spenders are able to do this. And I should also note that the most expensive races of 2018, the seats currently held by Alyssa Slotkin and Haley Stevens, also the entire cost of the race in those districts cost about $15 million each. So moving on to the state legislature.
There's no good time to lose.
That too was a record-setting election. About $34 million was spent. And what's increasingly disturbing is that while the top 10 races are also record-breaking and represented about half of the overall total of that spending, those top 10 most competitive districts, the average cost of these races went up from about $153,000 in 2018 to $271 in 2020. And that increase is really significant when I should say that the overall cost of state legislative races only increased about $8 million from 2018. So I think it's of particular note, however, that there was significantly less dark money spending in 2020 as opposed to 2018. And I think that you could attribute this to really the emphasis on federal races, on the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, and the presidency. The concentration, though, of money among a few of these districts really underscores how few of them are seriously competitive with current maps. And I'm going to be interested to see after the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission does their work, whether we see more competitive districts across the board. And I think it's also important to note that the caucus committees still dominate these close races. They're able to spend unlimited amounts supporting their candidates. And the image at your right really showcases their ability. These are ads created by the House Republican Campaign Committee, where they spent a day or two and filmed ads for all of the close races where they wanted to be spending money in them. And you'll notice in these images that while it's supposedly these representatives in their districts talking to constituents, all 5 of them are speaking to the same police officer, unnamed police officer. And he was in about 8 different ads for 8 different representatives. And but this coordination allows them to save a lot of money and be really effective. Now, the other races MCFN watched was the Supreme Court, which cost about $11 million. And that's pretty in line with what we've seen in the past decade. But a worrying long-time trend is how outside spending is still dominating in this race. Outside groups spent about $6.8 million of all that money. And one single super PAC, Justice for All, spent about $2.7 million. This is an organization that was fronted by the Michigan Association for Justice. And this sort of PAC was able to accept corporate donations. And so it got really large contributions from a lot of law firms and supported exclusively who was at the time the Chief Justice Bridget McCormick, and then the challenger candidate Elizabeth Welch, who was running for an open seat. And they essentially ran hand in hand, and that's how they were presented by Justice for All. And in certain instances, you really see Justice for All and the campaigns themselves using the same graphics. This graphic at right appeared in advertisements for the 2 candidates from their campaigns and in Justice for All advertisements at the same time. So with that overview of the 2020 elections, let's talk about, sort of why this matters and where we're situated in all of this. So I think it's good to have a comparative perspective in terms of where we are now and where we came from. And I'm sure, as many of you know, there's a series of court decisions that have loosened campaign finance spending and regulations around dark money over the past 10 years or so. But this is money that is regulated, it's not dark money, and is able to see. And if you look at 2 decades of donations to Michigan legislative candidates, striking difference emerges. In the first decade of the 21st century, well, let me first say that I've split up these donations to their campaigns into 4 categories. You got small donors who are contributing less than $200, and then large individual donors who are contributing more than $200. So the limit's about $1,000 for the House and about $2,000 for the Senate to campaigns. And then the third category, you have PACs, which can contribute much more. They can contribute 10 times the amount an individual can, and in the case of caucus PACs, unlimited amounts. And then there's also self-funding. And when you look at these 2 decades, in the first decade of the 21st century, PACs were still the primary donors behind these candidates, giving them the most amount of money. But the individuals were, competitive. They were contributing a little more than about 2/3 as much as PACs. And then in the second decade, from 2010 to 2019, this is where PAC spending really took off. And you can see that it essentially doubled, and as did large individual donors. But the smaller donors contributing less than $200 only increased a little bit, despite the fact that total overall donations to legislative candidates essentially doubled. So what we're seeing is sort of a concentration of power of money in these legislative races. And I think that that's concerning at probably a pretty basic democratic level. So let's explain, I guess, from the gubernatorial perspective as well, going back to 2 years ago in 2018. This is a comparison of Snyder's first term in office, where he was elected, to Whitmer's, and there's a striking difference. And in terms of candidate spending, that doubled, but it's really in reported independent expenditures and unreported issue ads. In other words, essentially dark money, that you really see things take off. I'd say 2020 is somewhat unique in that there wasn't quite as much dark money spending, but at the state level in 2018, that certainly was not the case. And this really shows the striking contrast between these 2 decades and sort of where we may unfortunately be headed. I think it's also worth talking about a little bit the impact that the pandemic has had. I think that this graph is really illustrative of that there wasn't actually all that much impact on fundraising. When you look at 2016, there's a pretty steady rise. These are the same categories that I showed in the previous graphic with PACs, small and large individuals, and self-funding campaigns, and these are legislative candidates. But really, the only impact that we saw during the stay-at-home order was that PAC donations actually trailed off and leveled out for the duration of the stay-at-home order, and then came roaring back. And there's no mysterious cause behind this. It's simply because Lansing has a very strong fundraising culture. Often, the way that interest groups and lobbyists get FaceTime with legislators is they attend fundraisers being held at one of up-teen multi-client lobbying firms around the city. They pay several $100s to come in and get a ticket, and then they have FaceTime with that legislator, and that multi-$100 contribution goes into that candidate's account. This gives incumbents, despite our very severe term limits, this gives incumbent legislators a huge financial advantage over their opponents, because this is a pretty easy and convenient way to raise a lot of money. But it also underscores how important it is for that face-to-face interaction. And I think that showing in the 2020 on this right-hand side here, how individual donations were more or less fine during this period, but PACs trailed off, the importance of sort of that glad handing and what that means for our politics. So another facet of the 2020 election that I think is an ongoing trend and really important for our politics is that we are becoming, both as a society and politically, increasingly internet-oriented. Presidential ads in Michigan alone in Facebook news feeds appeared at least 2 billion times in this election, which is an absurd number. And most of these, were not PACs, super PACs, candidates. It was a broad number, thousands of different pages mentioning them. And these ads can be highly targeted based upon individual behavioral traits, which means that while not as much money is spent on them yet as is spent on television and radio, they're often much more effective in terms of their bang for their buck. The ad at right is an example of one of these. It's some Facebook page called United Research Group. It only had a couple hundred likes, but spent hundreds of thousands of dollars fielding these, what appears to be a survey to Michigan voters. And it asked in hundreds of different iterations, how would you rate Trump? And then there's, I somewhat approve, I strongly approve. And you could click any one of them you want, but it would lead you to an online survey. And then what that would do is ask you a series of questions that would become increasingly leading, and eventually it sort of becomes out there that this is a progressive organization that's asking you these questions, and it's what we would call a push pull, where they give you your talking points in the form of a survey. But what that meant is that as you filled out and as you answered all these questions, that information was now linked to your Facebook account. And it turned out, thanks to some New York Times reporting, that this page was run by Acronym, which was one of the largest super PACs on the liberal side in this election. And so they were able to use all of this detailed information then to then serve you ads that would be that you'd be more suggestible towards and would be more persuasive to you based upon your answers and all the other data they had regarding you. And this is a trend we're increasingly seeing. It's pretty commonplace at the federal level, and we're starting to see that trickle down to the state level as well. So it's important to categorize political money in terms of 3 different types. And the first one is hard money. This is what you would really consider traditional political spending. This money is given directly to candidates or political parties. It uses something that we call direct advocacy, meaning that they're going to ask for your vote and they're going to say, please vote for me. And the candidate will often be talking to the camera. And most of the time, it's subjected to campaign finance system rules. There's contribution limits, there's no corporate money allowed, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll show you an example of that. This is an ad from then Republican U.S. Senate candidate John James.
My dad, the storyteller, he told me how the son of a slave became a sharecropper, the son of a sharecropper became a mason, and the son of a mason became an entrepreneur.
So you were listening. That's our family story. I drilled it into his hard head.
Yes, sir, you did. And I'm proud to teach my sons that this is the only country where you can go from slave to senator in 4 generations and from poverty to prosperity in 1.
Now don't mess up this race.
We're John James, and we approve this message.
Very wholesome and heartwarming, right? The second category here now is it has been around for a while. There we go. And that's soft money. And this has been an issue for a long time, since the 70s actually, but kind of rose to prominence in the late 90s and was a target of the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act of 2002, known as McCain-Feingold. This is what we call issue advocacy money. And the telltale signs of this soft money spending is that they are not going to say, please vote for this person, don't vote for this person. Instead, they are going to ask you things like, tell Senator Peters to vote yes on Senate Bill 419, or tell Rep. Stevens to stop subsidizing weapons of war, something like that. And they're never, but this in a campaign season obviously gives them a lot of leeway to essentially run a campaign ad that just doesn't use those explicit words like vote. There's a number of different words that are explicitly banned. And this is generally how outside spending is used to influence elections. And it's important to note that they're not allowed to directly coordinate with campaigns. One example of this here is a bit of a non-traditional one, because often you see this from issue-related PACs or advocacy organizations. But this one is a mailing actually sent out by the Michigan Republican Party that said the media is controlling what you know, and look inside to see what the media isn't telling you. And then when you open it up, it says, this is the truth. And then it says a lot of great things about then President Trump and the things he did during the coronavirus. But again, it does not say, re-elect President Trump or anything of that nature. It's issue advocacy. And they're not allowed to directly coordinate with campaigns, but we'll see, that's pretty easily circumvented. Now, the third category here is dark money. And dark money is a relatively new, but not totally new instrument. It's been around for quite some time, but the whole idea of it is that it is essentially soft money with a hidden source. It basically has to play by the same rules as soft money, can't tell you how to vote, and it generally oftentimes discloses kind of who pays for it in a disclaimer, but that's not going to lead you anywhere. And and the way that it gets into the elections is relatively straightforward. Generally, you have a dark money source, whether it's a corporation, billionaire, the janitor who lives down the street, it doesn't matter. But what they'll do is contribute money to a financial entity that doesn't have to disclose where its donors come from. Usually, and I highlighted the box here, that comes in the form of nonprofits or 501c4 social welfare organizations. And while they are tax exempt, well, they're not tax exempt, their donations are not, but they file they do have filings with the IRS. They don't have to say who their donors are. And they generally will feed their funds into super PACs. And while super PACs have to disclose who their donors are, they just disclose that it's this nonprofit, this 501c4, and then you will never know who's really behind that fundraising effort. So just because you see a disclaimer in an advertisement doesn't necessarily mean you know who's funding it. Most of the time it does not, unless it's a campaign. They also can use shell companies as a vehicle at times, and generally it manifests itself in the form of ads, which is why I've been talking so much about political advertisements. But there's other means that's more difficult for us to showcase. Dark money can be spent on volunteers, and it can be spent to pay for opposition research, where the dark money is funding an organization that's having people dig up dirt on candidates and then happens to post it publicly or any other thing. But the vast majority of what you see is, and the way dark money directly tries to influence our elections, is through advertising. And I think that 2020 has been pretty clear through the deluge of ads that you all have seen that this is really sort of reaching a crest. So it's important to note that while dark money says that it can't coordinate with campaigns, oftentimes that's not quite the case. Let's first watch this video, and then we can talk a little bit more about this.
He's been called one of the most effective members of the U.S. Senate, Gary Peters. He served in the Navy Reserve, and after the September 11th attacks, volunteered to serve again. In the Senate, Gary Peters voted to get our troops the pay raise they deserve and worked to keep Michigan safe.
The way I look at this, we should not be even thinking about Democratic ideas and Republican ideas. We should just be thinking about ideas that are good for the country, ideas that are great for Michigan.
Thank Gary Peters. Tell him to keep fighting for Michigan.
Now, there's a lot of good footage in there, right? You get to see him get on a hog, ride around, talk to constituents. It looks just like a campaign ad, but it's not. VoteVets Action Fund is a dark money organization. And the way that they're able to do this without running afoul of the law is campaigns give them this stuff publicly. What Gary Peters did, and many other candidates did this in the 2020 election cycle, is he posted a page on his website called What Michiganders Need to Know. And on that, it had polling tested messaging, knowing what talking points would resonate most with Michiganders based upon the polling they did. They posted a large downloadable reel of stock footage of Gary Peters doing various things without audio, which is what you saw in that advertising, and posted their own preferred talking points and narratives. And so then these organizations, as you saw in the Peter Meyer ads, are able to take all that information and then just create their own advertisements almost in a cut and paste format. And so it makes it really difficult to really even distinguish whether an ad's from a campaign or an interest group if you're a casual viewer. Paul Young in the 8th Congressional District, for example, he posted the B-roll on the homepage of his website. If you go and look him up and you want to research him as a candidate, and you scroll down a little bit, you'll find a 5-minute video of him walking around and talking to people. There's no sound, and it just plays, and you would have no idea what this is for. But the reason why it was on the homepage of his website is to attract dark money advertisers. Similarly, there was FEC complaints in the last election filed against both John James and Gary Peters, saying that they put out press releases. Well, in the case, John James put out a press release talking about this stuff and sort of publicly soliciting, at least that's the allegation, dark money organizations to run advertisements based on the information in the press release. So the idea that candidates can't coordinate with dark money organizations is true, but it doesn't mean that they can't just in a one-way fashion provide them with all the information they need to craft a very savvy ad. And so that's where non-coordination almost is more or less a myth. So let's talk a little bit more about the structure of campaign finance in Michigan. So there's really sort of 3 tiers, and this is to give you all hopefully a good idea of how our campaign finance system works. And so these 3 tiers are first the one that we've talked about quite a bit, the congressional races, which is administered by the Federal Election Commission, the FEC. If you want to see those records, you can look up candidates because that information is digitized and online at fec.gov. It's really easy to search. You can look at individual contributors. You can see how much money they raised in total. It's a pretty convenient source. But at the state level, that's where things get a little bit hairier. Michigan candidates in Michigan and PACs in general looking to influence state elections have to file and register with the Michigan Department of State. They are regulated by a law called the Michigan Campaign Finance Act, which is enforced, patrolled by the Michigan Department of State. And if they believe someone has done something to violate that law, they then refer that information to the Attorney General. So I guess enforce may not be the best word in the slide, but you get my gist. Now, while those records are digitized and online, they don't necessarily provide you with easy totals that span an election cycle in all instances. And you won't be able to look up and see, per se, who the top contributor to a candidate is. That's something that we offer on our website, mcfn.org. That information is in the process of being updated, and we should have complete donation totals up to the most recent campaign finance period by the beginning of May, once again, as this is a process that we do by hand, and it's significantly time-consuming. Now, I also wanted to focus on this because it's not something MCFN has talked much about in the past, but is extremely important, and that's local campaign finance. And so for all candidates who their jurisdiction is entirely within the bounds of a single county, other than state legislators, they file as a candidate with your county clerk, and then they also file all their campaign finance filings with that clerk. And what this means is that there is an enormous and very discongruous patchwork of records that can, depending upon where you live, either be very easy or very arduous to access. And what that means is that if you live in, say, Macomb, Oakland, or Wayne, which I would doubt that any of the viewers on this presentation do, you're in luck. You can go online, you can go on the county website and look up campaign finance filings for whomever you'd like, and they're available online. But for the majority of counties in Michigan, there are no online, searchable, easily available campaign finance records. What you have to do is go to your county clerk's office, or you can call or email them too, I suppose, and ask them specifically for the records you're looking for. And some of them will give them to you for free. Some of them might charge you to scan them, or let's say you live in Livingston County and they charge you $3 per page, which makes it pretty difficult for citizens to have oversight of their local officials and see who's funding their candidates. Now, the other difficult thing about local campaign finance in Michigan is that while these county clerks are publicly elected, some of them are trained as clerks. I would highly doubt that many of them are trained as campaign finance attorneys as well. And it's up to these county clerks running, while maintaining all of their other records and court systems and everything else. They also have to monitor and flag potential violations of the Michigan Campaign Finance Act for the filings they receive. And I can speak personally and say that that's an extremely difficult job if you don't have the technical training for it and you don't know what to look for, much less a thin budget and too much to do in too little time. So they're not quite in the 21st century yet. And I know that it's been a complaint of clerks for a while, but that is where that stands, and it remains an ongoing issue. So just to show another, downside of local campaign finance too, is that because local media institutions have, so many of them have gone out of business, there's not as much oversight of candidates from the reporters who know how to use these local systems as there has been in the past. Here's an example of that from even Wayne County, who has online available records. This is a 2016 filing from now the late Wayne County Sheriff Benny Napoleon, who unfortunately passed from COVID. But a colleague of mine, a reporter in Detroit, wrote a story in 2020 where all he did was simply look through the campaign finance records and see what he was spending campaign funds on. And you can see it right here at the top of the filing, clear as day, that he spent $5,000 of his campaign funds on Ford Field for Lions tickets. And he would say, his response to this was that, oh, he's a public figure, he needs to make himself publicly visible, and this is his ability to make an appearance in front of his constituents. And while that's perhaps plausible, we found examples of this that were even more egregious. I worked with the Michigan School of Journalism last year, and we did a survey of local campaign finance to see how hard it was to get records from each county. And in one example, we got campaign finance records from the Monroe County Drain Commissioner. It turns out he had also spent campaign funds on a baseball suite. The thing is, it wasn't with his constituents. It was across the border at a Toledo Mud Hens game in Ohio. So I doubt that he would have the same rationale there. And if we can go into a little bit of depth here to talk about the committee types in Michigan and how they work, because it's different than federal system a little bit. What really are most important here for you folks is generally, well, I guess all of these do have some importance, but candidate committees, there are contribution limits depending upon the office. At the county level, it's depending upon population size. Can't accept corporate donations from businesses. They can give $100 to other candidates, but everyone who raises or spends more than $5,000 in an election cycle has to file campaign finance disclosures. Now, there's also committees that have to be formed for ballot questions. These could be a committee to support a school district millage, or it could be a statewide constitutional amendment. Those sort of questions will depend upon where they file, but these are also very loosely regulated committees in that they can accept unlimited corporate dollars. And we have examples where, for example, the Unlock Michigan petition that's currently circulating, where they want to rescind the governor's emergency powers. A lot of people are enthusiastic about this. It's gotten a lot of signatures, but the funding for it, 86% of it is from a single 501c4 organization, a dark money organization that hides its donors and it has ties to Michigan Senate Republican leadership. But they will not reveal what the source of those contributions are. It's in excess of $1 million. And the Department of State ruled just this end of last week that they don't have to reveal that either. In 2012, for example, in favor of another ballot question, an organization gave 99.99% of all of the money to that committee from a 501c4, but the Department of State said that wasn't okay. So there's a whole lot of nuance going on here. Anyway, independent PACs now are really the preferred vehicle for Michigan's wealthy and legislators themselves to spread their influence. And that's because it essentially acts like a person. It can give directly to candidates at 10 times the individual limit. So if you can give $1,050 to a state representative candidate, they can give $10,500, and they can accept unlimited contributions. So if you have a bunch of money to spread around, you can give, $1 million to an independent PAC, and then they'll give every candidate $10,000. Now, these are also used by legislators themselves as leadership PACs. What they do is they go around and solicit donations to these, and then they can go around and, in turn, give money to their colleagues, and it allows them to curry favor and spread influence that way. Caucus PACs, though, is really where we see the sort of wealthiest Michiganders give money, because you can give up to $41,975 per year to a caucus PAC, and then that can spend unlimited amounts of money supporting candidates. And so what you'll see is that a campaign will raise $300,000 in a competitive district, and then in the 5 or 6 weeks before the election, the caucus PAC will spend $700,000 on ad buys, and it just swamps these competitive races with money. We don't need to go too much into political parties, but just know that political or independent expenditure committees are Michigan's version of a super PAC, and they have unlimited raising and spending and cannot coordinate with candidates. Justice for All is one example of these. So what we can't see in Lansing is quite a bit. we have some of the worst transparency laws and worst anti-corruption measures in the nation. In 2015, the Center for Public Integrity, ranked us 50 out of 50 in terms of states with transparency measures. And similarly, the Coalition for Integrity, a different organization, ranked us 47th out of 50 in 2020 among states with anti-corruption measures, because we don't have much independent ethics oversight. We cannot use the Freedom of Information Act or public open records laws to submit a public records request to the legislature or the governor. They're both exempt. Michigan requires no financial disclosures or rules regarding outside income or beneficiary before entering office or during. At the end of last year, I found evidence that the two highest paid staffers in the Michigan House, the Majority Chief of Staff and the Director of External Affairs, both one of which makes more money than the governor, while being Majority Chief of Staff, had owned a consulting firm that the House Republican caucus was paying, and that his consulting firm, while he was working as a staffer in the Michigan House, had been paid more than $1 million. And there's no rules that prohibit this, and there's no laws that would either. Now, administrative accounts and LLCs organized for office holders, parties, and caucuses are also rife. The parties, the Department of State has ruled both the Democratic and Republican Party can have accounts where they don't have to disclose anything about them, and they can accept unlimited corporate contributions as long as it's not used for explicitly political purposes. So they could get $10 million from Ebel Incorporated as long as it's used to build a new headquarters and not buy campaign ads. Similarly, we saw an example of dark money playing a role recently with the Michigan House, where the House Democratic Caucus, for inexplicable reasons, had not hired a press secretary, and instead was paying a public relations firm to send out press releases on behalf of the caucus, and they would not tell reporters what the source of the funding was. And so you can decide for yourselves whether that means a lack of accountability or saving of taxpayer dollars, as they put it. So I think a really important question that is not often asked by advocates of reform is we need to address what we want from campaign finance reform, because that determines the kind of fixes that we want to imply. Do you want total disclosure and transparency? That's something that I personally believe is very difficult to get at legally, because you can say that someone has to report the original source of the funds. And if it's behind one nonprofit, you could say who donated to that nonprofit. But what if the donor to that nonprofit was another nonprofit? And generally, if there's a way to obfuscate something, to obscure it, that takes one hoop, those parties who are looking to hide the source of their money can easily give you 2 or 3 or 4 hurdles to jump over if it means that they don't have to have that accountability. Another example could be spending limits. Do we want to overall limit the amount of money that can be spent in an election? At the federal level, the Supreme Court has ruled that that's unconstitutional under the First Amendment. So this is something that'd be an ambitious change. And then there's egalitarianism, which I think is something that a lot of academics believe is more within reach. The idea that we can level the playing field between big money sources and small-time individual contributors. But I think the jury is out on that in a big way, and that we're really looking to see how we can do that. Regulated speech, again, this is an ambitious goal, but it sort of allows you to pretty precisely define what you want to be allowable and not allowable in political advertising, for example, or what you're doing in a campaign season. And perhaps you want to go shoot for the moon and all of that. But I think it's important to address these questions and make these decisions because you can complain a lot about the problems, but if you don't have a prescribed solution, it's really hard to agitate for change. So I think that there's an interesting counterpoint in this too. and that Kenneth Gross, not the devil in this slide, is a good person, but he's a respected authority on governmental ethics and a former attorney for the FEC. He believes that allowing people to give more money on an individual level directly to campaigns is perhaps better because it works against some of the outside money, which is really the wealthiest Americans are using these outside spending organizations, these outside spending groups to funnel their money through the political system. Whereas, perhaps if they could give it to campaigns, that they would just do that instead. So he told me that he sees the campaign finance system as a balloon, and that when you press down on one place, it pops out somewhere else. And it's not that the money is going away, it's just going to find another way into the political system. This is somewhat of a cynical view, but I think it's really interesting to think about unintended consequences when we're looking at fixes here. So a case in point of this is the political mail in 2020. We saw a record amount of political mail enter Michigan in 2020. I'm sure that many of you were deluged with advertisements for Trump and Biden. And the thing is, it said that these were all paid for by Michigan Democratic and the Michigan Republican Party. What they did is Biden and Trump both set up what we call joint fundraising accounts, where they both took almost all of the state parties in the nation, the RNC and DNC, and their own campaigns, and made a single committee where you could contribute to all of them at once. And what that meant is that the contribution limit to that joint fundraising committee was the limits for all of those committees combined. So $700,000 or $800,000 for each on Trump's and Biden's side. And then these very wealthy Americans would make six-figure contributions, spread out to all these committees, and then all of those committees would transfer them back to the states where they wanted them to spend money. Michigan, as a newly minted battleground state, was one of these. And so we got about $21 million of this joint fundraising committee money into Michigan, and then Michigan's political parties paid the vendors that the campaigns had already arranged to send out the campaigns mailers, but they could do unlimited amounts of money with it. And so my point is that if there's a way to circumvent these rules, the multitude of lawyers and consultants and politicos will find a way to do that. And so there is a lot of difficulty in this, but it's still an achievable reform. So here are some examples of things that are being tried elsewhere and that are really hopeful, as in terms of a lot of these are, egalitarianism related. One, in New York City, is an 8-to-1 small dollar contribution matching program, meaning that if you give less than $250, the city will match that 8-to-1. So a $200 contribution will get $1,600 from the city, and there's a ceiling on the amount of money. Now, the downside to this, obviously, is it's publicly expensive, costs the city a lot, and marginal candidates can receive like six-figure sums from these committees. Like if you there was a candidate who received something like 300 votes, but it cost the city $130,000 in public matching funds. Excuse me. In Seattle, Washington, for example, a democracy voucher program is being implemented, meaning that residents are given democracy vouchers of, I think, equate to like $300. And then they can't do anything with the money, but they can give the democracy vouchers to different city candidates, and then the city directly pays those candidates based upon the vouchers for their campaigns. Australia, Japan, France, and other countries have simply shorter campaign seasons where, I don't know about you, but I felt that the last campaign season was at least 10 years long, and they limit it to, in some cases, 6 or 8 weeks, and the candidates are not allowed to actively campaign. Obviously, some of them find ways to skirt this, and in Australia, we haven't seen necessarily that means that there is less money being spent either, but it's definitely an interesting approach. And advocates here in the United States are also pushing for a constitutional amendment. Along with that, there is a 28th amendment to the U.S. Constitution is supported primarily by the organization American Promise. And then there's also the legislation currently moving through Congress called H.R. 1, which has campaign finance reform among a multitude of other reforms within it. But its hopes in the Senate are not too bright at the moment. So let me also talk about briefly reform prospects at home, because we've actually seen a lot of hopeful signs that we might actually see some incremental moves in the right direction in this legislative session. One of them is a couple packages of bills that are would subject the governor and legislators to open records laws, although they would have more caveats and be differently administered than the open records laws that apply to the rest of government in Michigan. There's also legislation being introduced that would have a 2-year cooling off period for ex-legislators. With severe term limits, often you see legislators leaving office and then showing up on the first day of next session as a lobbyist. Because if you're only able to work here for at maximum 14 years, and you like the city and you like the politics, that's one of the de facto ways to return. Another one is requiring candidate financial disclosures. This was introduced as a package of bills just this week, but we have yet to see if that's actually going to move. The Secretary of State is also advocating for campaign finance reforms, including more frequent filing for candidates, which I think would be a really important reform, because we're often waiting months to find out how much money was spent right after Election Day, which is really makes accountability as a journalist difficult. But I will say that the first one, the bills that subject the governor and legislators to open records laws, already passed the House. It's going to pass the Senate committee, and it's really up to Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey to whether or not this is going to get on the floor for a vote and be passed. So a lot is up in the air, but these are hopeful indications that we can, sort of bring some more ethics to government. So with that, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments you might have for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. That was really interesting. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else did too. I think we'll just maybe have one question from each of our question people. And so, Linda, did you have a question that came through on Zoom? You need to unmute.
I just unmuted.
Okay.
I have a question for Simon, and thank you very much for your presentation. Has any progress been made in recent years to improve the way Michigan funds elections? And if not, why?
Are you referring to the administration of elections, like the running of polling places, or like the funding of campaigns?
I'm assuming it is campaigns. This isn't my question. It's from one of our viewers. And it's just asking about, what are we doing?
Yeah, so Michigan does have a public financing system for gubernatorial elections. But after candidates reach a certain threshold, those public funds are no longer available. Similar to the presidential financing system, where if you raise above a certain amount, you opt out of public financing. And the most expensive election in Michigan's history before 2020 was the 2018 gubernatorial election at about $93 million. And so without a more robust public financing system or another sort of innovation being employed, I don't think we're going to see much of a role for the public financing system into the future, because it simply isn't large enough in magnitude to make a difference for these candidates. I think that a small dollars matching program is being explored by some researchers in Michigan, and that might be an interesting way to sort of fund elections in a way that encourages more individual participation.
Thank you.
There was another one that just came in as well, and I'll go ahead and read that one for you. How detailed does the reporting have to be in Michigan? Do candidates get away with reporting general expenses like Amazon for $10,000 without telling what those items are? And this person also loves Seattle's democracy vouchers.
Yeah, it's a really interesting program, but usually if they're doing something like paying a credit card bill, they're supposed to itemize those expenses. And this is not to, I'm not casting aspersions on the Department of State because they have a limited budget. They only have so many sort of enforcement related employees they can hire, and they can only, as these disclosures become increasingly voluminous, it becomes more and more difficult for them to enforce the law. But unfortunately, we see that a lot of this is left up to committees, and the state has to decide which violations they really want to go after and prosecute, excuse me. And unfortunately, I think perhaps too often we see candidates and campaigns getting away with putting credit card bill payment as their expenditure, and the disclosure division allowing them to leave it at that.
Sue, did you want to give one question?
Yes, I have just one. You mentioned earlier that PACs don't have to specifically disclose their donors, but is there any way to find out who supports or donates to a PAC?
No, PACs in Michigan do have to disclose their donors. The way in which PACs are able to hide the sources of their money is when the entity contributing to that PAC is a dark money organization, such as a 501c4 or an LLC, in other words, a company. Because super PACs, both in at the federal level and at the state level, can give or can receive contributions from nonprofits and LLCs, companies, then they're able to hide the sources of their funding that way.
Linda, I think you have another question that came in.
I do. What would a punishment be in Michigan for violating disclosure laws?
Mm-hmm. So that's a question of scale. So there's different fines for different violations. And then if you do the same violation like dozens or hundreds of times, then the fine can become very large. But again, it really depends. Failing to file, for example, failing to file disclosures at all starts with a small fee if you're late. And then the more late you are, the larger the fine becomes.
Thank you. I have another question here. What can the average citizens do to reduce the use of LLC or nonprofits in campaign finance? Also, what would you advise citizens to do to promote reform?
Well, on both, I guess the second question is the answer to the first, which is you have to advocate for reform. The Supreme Court has ruled on issues of corporate personhood that these entities, both corporations and nonprofits, have a right to speech under the First Amendment. You can't arbitrarily limit their speech, and at the same turn, that means that if you want reform, you'd have to go often a constitutional route, and you'd have to be advocating for amendments to the First Amendment, or at least the court's interpretation of it, in order to regulate that speech. I think that LLCs and nonprofits are used broadly because they're allowed to hide funds. At the same time, you could also advocate for legislation that prevents these sort of entities from not disclosing their contribution sources. You could change the way IRS has 501cs report their contributors. But again, this is an enormous apparatus. Philanthropy is huge in the United States, and 501c4s, these nonprofits, are used not just by political organizations, but by an enormous number of philanthropic institutions who value having anonymous donors. So that's where things get difficult, right? And so then we go back to speech, and it's a difficult issue, but I think it's important if you want to for citizens to promote reform to first, there's sort of a buffet, a menu of options about how we could change our systems. And you should really look at sort of the different options that are available and think about what would be best for Michigan, and listen to people talk about them, and really decide for yourself which one you want to push for. Our organization is not advocational. We don't prescribe or say that this is a necessary fix the campaign finance system needs, but we sort of try to illustrate the problems with it and some of the solutions that are being offered.
Thank you.
We have one more that just came in that I'll go ahead and read this one as well. Would a reform be to invest in the commission and the State Department of State that does the policing? Secretary of State, I'm sorry, that does the policing, could by increasing their staffing so that they can better monitor violations and do the digging into campaign finance forms? Would that be a way to add something to advocate for a reform?
I think that could certainly be useful advocacy. The campaign finance system that Michigan runs is extremely dated. It's difficult to find data and find specific information, though it's easily enough done if you want to. I think that also, if we're looking at in terms of like the magnitude of fixes that and like the amount that we could benefit Michigan's campaign finance system, granting county clerks access to the digital and electronic filing systems that everyone at the state level is required to use would change campaign finance enormously, because then it would mean that everyone at the local level could also look at, your city council person's campaign finance statements at home and not have to, really be super duper motivated to find out that information. But yeah, I mean, that I think that that's certainly a reform that could be pushed for. It's just a question of whether you can get a Republican majority legislature to agree to increasing bureaucratic staffing. And it can be a tough sell.
Okay, Sue, do you have one question, and then we'll probably have to wrap this up?
Yes. Can you tell us how your organization, the Michigan Campaign Finance Network, is funded? And do you get pushback from the PACs or politicians?
Yeah, so we're funded largely by grassroots donors, just like you all watching this presentation. And so we rely on your support to continue being funded and operate. It's what allows me to give these presentations and do the research that I do. So we always appreciate individual contributors because they form the backbone of this organization. And yeah, we do receive pushback. As a nonpartisan organization, often it's really tough to do anything in this political environment without being accused of being partisan in some way. So if you can be accused of both being a liberal and a conservative in a relatively short time frame, then that's how you know that you're being relatively neutral. And there's also an industry around this. There are people in Lansing who, just average everyday people, but what they do is they help political entities, consultants, whoever, make dark money organizations or make front organizations so they can funnel money into some political venture without it being known where it's coming from. And some of those people understand that they're just doing their job and I'm doing my job, and this is obviously an issue that's important to me, and they're fine. But then there's others who really don't like me and don't like journalists who actually want to find out the truth about where this money is coming from because they don't think anyone should care.
Well, thank you. We're happy that you care.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a disappointing or a discouraging job at times, but the fact that in a hyper-partisan environment, I can sort of advocate and look after things that are sort of fundamentally democratic values is, I think I'm pretty lucky.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. This was, as I said, very interesting, and I think people really learned a lot tonight. So this concludes our discussion for this evening. So thank you so much for listening. And again, thank you, Simon, for your presentation. Good night.
Thanks.